Welcome back to another edition of our studies on the Sermon on the Mount, dealing with important issues in life. We have dealt with the Beatitudes, going through all 8 Beatitudes, and now we're going to see Jesus is going to teach us how we apply those Beatitudes in life. And today we're going to be dealing with a very important area of life, and that's sexuality. So we're going to look at Matthew 5, verses 27 to 31. All right, so we're going to be reading from Matthew 5, verses 27 onwards. You have heard that it was said, you shall not commit adultery. But I say to you, that everyone who looks at a woman with lustful intent has already committed adultery with her in the heart. If your right eye causes you to sin, tear it out and throw it away. For it's better for you to lose one of your members than your whole body is thrown into hell. And if your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off and throw it away. For it is better that you lose one of your members than for your whole body to go into hell. So, we've come to the topic of sexuality, we've come to the topic of lust, something that is so intimately familiar with all of us because we are all created as sexual beings. We've got different attitudes in life. We've got the Victorian era attitude where sex was hardly talked about. When I remember Queen Victoria, when her daughter wanted to get married and asked her about sex one night, she just said, just lie down, close your eyes and think of England. And from that extreme, you come to today where you actually have films like 50 Shades of Grey and other films which are so explicitly talking about sex. Society's attitudes towards sex will differ with time. They progress with time. If you look at this study from 1972 to 2012, you can find that the drift of society is towards a more permissive attitude towards adult premarital sex as well as homosexual sex, adult same-sex level. Now, as far as teenage sex is concerned or extramarital affairs, society has been consistently negative on that. The next data is the second Australian study of health and relationships in attitudes towards sex, looking at Australians aged 16 to 69, and you can find that premarital sex is uniformly acceptable. Over 90% of adults who were actually surveyed, whereas extramarital sex was not favored at all. Also find that religion has a large part to play with sexuality. Here's a study of 10 different countries which was published in 2012 looking at the probability of reporting premarital sex, and you can find the probability of reporting this is the least in Muslims, then followed by Hindus, traditional people and Christians. Unfortunately, the probability of reporting premarital sex is also quite high. The biblical sexual ethic has always been one man, one woman in a covenantal relationship. And this stems all the way from Genesis chapter 2, verse 24. Remember when God first created a woman, and he describes the exclusive relationship between man and woman. Verses 24, therefore a man shall leave his father and mother and hold fast to his wife, and they shall become one flesh. And the man and the woman were both naked and not ashamed. And this describes their relationship, sexual as well as psychological, emotional, all together as one, and they were not ashamed. However, when you come to the fall of man in Genesis chapter 3 and subsequently in 1 Corinthians chapter 6, Paul deals with sexual immorality amongst the new church in Corinth. And the new church in Corinth have a very laissez-faire attitude towards sex because they are brought up in a secular manner where you actually have temple prostitutions. In the city of Corinth, there was a temple called at the Acropolis, which is the highest mountain above Corinth, and there they actually have 1,000 temple priestesses who offered sexual services. Now, so the people in church were tempted, and Paul writes in 1 Corinthians chapter 6, verses 12 to 13, all things are lawful for me, but not all things are helpful. All things are lawful for me, but I will not be dominated by anything. Food is meant for the stomach and stomach for the food. And God will destroy both one and the other. The body is not meant for sexual immorality, but for the Lord, and the Lord for the body. So therefore, he's saying that sex is not just an appetite to be satisfied. Sex is more. It has a special meaning. It's actually made to glorify God. So, you can have two kinds of sexual relationships that we can see in general. One is the consumer sexual relationship, and the other one is a covenantal sexual relationship. On the consumer side, the consumer sexual relationship is contingent on the provision of goods and services. I mean, you provide sex in exchange for something. Whereas when you're in the covenant relationship, the sex is actually unconditional. Number two, it's the consumer provides sex at a good price, but this may need to be upgraded from time to time. For the covenantal relationship, the sex is performance independent. It doesn't matter how it is independent. It is dependent on a commitment, a covenant, so therefore the performance is not dependent, covenant is not dependent on the performance. Number three, my needs are going to be more important than my relationship because I entered the sexual relationship to satisfy my sexual needs, so therefore my needs are more important than my relationship in a consumer relationship. Whereas in the covenantal relationship is my needs are less important than the relationship. So therefore the relationship is paramount. This relationship is the one that governs the sexual relationship. And number four, in a consumer sexual relationship, you adjust to me or I leave. Whereas the covenantal relationship is I will adjust to you because I have made a promise. And that actually provides you the security for which the relationship can actually flourish. So, even though you are a Christian couple, you can still come into the marital relationship or any relationship with these two kinds of attitudes. For example, if you actually have one partner having a consumer attitude towards sex and the other partner having a covenantal attitude towards sex, then what you will find is there will be exploitation. One will exploit the other. When you have a couple where there is both believe that this is a covenant, then you actually provide security so you can be yourself. Otherwise, you're always having to market yourself. If you're deeply committed to the person, despite your feelings will grow deeper, just like a parent-child relationship. You have your freedom to be yourself. Imagine a parent-child relationship. You're so invested and you give and give to your child, and often you don't get very much back. But yet, you are committed, and the commitment actually brings you a deeper feeling which grows all the time. So the place of sex, if it is a consumer good, it will make you basically go into it because it makes me feel good about myself. It's intrinsically selfish. I'm taking, I'm not giving. And so this is the attitude of the Corinthians in 1 Corinthians 6:13. Food is meant for the stomach and stomach is for the food. It is a consumer good. It makes me feel good about myself. That is a wrong attitude towards sex. C.S. Lewis has a great quote on this concept called sexual integrity. He writes, the monstrosity of sexual intercourse outside of marriage is that those who indulge in it are trying to isolate one kind of union, the sexual union, from all kinds of other union which were intended to go along with it to make up the whole total union. To have physical union without having whole life union is actually a lack of integrity. Years ago, they actually had a very good movie, actually made Julia Roberts famous. It was called Pretty Woman. You remember that? That was a story of a rich man who came into Beverly Hills and hired the services of a prostitute. Her name was the character acted by Julia Roberts. And they had physical relationships. He actually hired her for I don't know whether it was a whole week or a whole month, but she was exclusively his, and he could do whatever he wanted with her, except she drew the line at kissing, because she felt that kissing meant she was giving all of herself rather than just her body. So that actually tells you, even among secular ideas in Hollywood, that sex is more than just physical. It's also emotional and psychological. Now, what is the place of sex within the marriage? a place of sex within marriage is that it's a covenant renewal ceremony. And when you actually have sex, it's actually an apparatus that actually brings you closer together. If you have sex inside a covenant, then the sex becomes a covenant renewal ceremony, like the Lord's Supper, as it were. It becomes a commitment apparatus because you're giving yourself over and over again, deepening, solidifying, and it's nurturing. I belong completely exclusively to you, and I'm acting it out, and I'm giving you my body as a token of I'm giving you my whole life. I'm open to you physically as a token of how I've opened myself to you in every other way. And if you do this, it becomes nurturing and deepening. However, in consumer sex, you're holding on to yourself. I'm taking, not giving. I'm receiving and not giving. You damage your own ability to be a commitment apparatus when you have sex within that kind of framework in the mind. Remember John White, famous psychiatrist who wrote the book called The Fight. He writes about this. The bodily exposure that arouses and accompanies sex can be profoundly symbolic and powerfully healing if it is a concrete sign of what is happening in the whole relationship. So it only makes sense that a sexual relationship be confined to a marriage for mutual disclosure and tender acceptance, and it's not the activity of the moment, but the fabric of a lifetime's weaving. Every time sex is a physical disclosure without being complete personal disclosure and commitment, some of its life-giving and healing nature is actually destroyed. So in the secular world, sex is a consumer good, where you actually give each other goods and services. If that's the case, why should you actually enter a covenant? So we can see the trend through Western countries and even our own countries that people tend to live together, because living together and trying things out, wouldn't it be better? But the data from all studies show that cohabiting prior to marriage actually associates with less happiness and more negativity in subsequent marriage if they do get married. Because the whole problem is exiting is hard. It's like Brexit. It's easy to get together, but exiting is very hard. This is an example. Somebody wrote about this in a relationship where they cohabited and then split. It's as hard as changing from iPhone to Android. This is how someone describes changing handphones. But sadly, now I'm feeling a bit stuck with Apple. I'd like to check out other smartphone platforms, but doing so is going to require some work on my part. Like many who've been sucked into Apple's clutches, it was innocent in the beginning. Initially, I didn't realize the commitment I was making. I didn't think about the fact that I was locking myself into a platform the rest of my life. But with each new product I brought from Apple, the deeper I fell into the bog, and I feel like it would be painful to break up with Apple, not because I love the products or the company so much, but because it would be a huge pain in the butt to transfer all my stuff to a new platform. So it's, cohabiting together is not so simple because of the breakup. Here's a testimony from a lady called Jennifer, actually written in the New York Times on the downside of cohabiting before marriage. And here she writes, "I felt like I was on this multi-year, never-ending audition to be his wife," she said. "We had all this furniture, we had our dogs, and the same friends. It just made it really difficult to break up. Then it was like we got married because we were living together once we got into our 30s. So that's the huge problem with living together before you get married. See, when you live together before you get married, you actually treat the other party like a commodity. The standard for you to get somebody to cohabit with actually entry level actually lower than for a spouse. And the inertia tends to box a person into a poor relationship and you actually have a greater chance of divorce. And what about the opportunity cost? Wasted years because you live together for so long and then you break up, which is actually, dating is actually quicker. Now, so in cohabitation, sex is actually marketing. Sex outside the covenant, like living together, does not prepare you for sex within a covenant. Learning to live together as consumers is not the same as learning to live together as covenanters. Next, we're going to be looking at the challenge of lust, which is what this passage is about. Just to start off, Jimmy Carter, the US president, who was a devout Baptist from Georgia, actually confessed many years ago. He said, "I've looked at many women with lust. I've committed adultery in my heart many times. God knows I will do this and forgives me." Actually, he misunderstands that any kind of sexual desire is terrible and you're going to be going to hell. Now, temptation and lust has been with us from time immemorial, even in times of AD 79, time of just beyond where Jesus lived, and in the ruins of Pompeii, which was destroyed by the volcano. You can see graffiti, and a lot of the graffiti was sexual in nature. Today, we don't have graffiti. Today, we have porn. And Pornhub, the world's largest porn site, has actually 33 billion visits in 2018 alone. 70% of them were men who visited this site, and 30%, believe it or not, were women. 68% of Christian men and 50% of pastors regularly view pornography regularly. And the worst thing is that 11 to 17-year-old boys are reported being its greatest users. Now, lust is the biggest downfall of Christians as well. And there was a study done by Howard Hendricks, and they showed there are 4 factors that are very important in the breakup of marriages and infidelity or adultery within Christian marriages. There were 4 things, and the first thing was there's no personal accountability, which means they don't have a group where they can actually share with, especially men. There's no time of personal prayer, Bible study, or reading, and more than 80% of the men spent significant time with another woman, especially in counseling. And number 4, all of these men had been convinced that this sort of fall would never happen to them. So these are 4 characteristics that are actually warnings to Christian men as well. Now, the word which Jesus used here, lust, is actually in the Greek translated as epithumias. Epi is towards, thumos is desire or strong desire or passion. That word is actually neutral. It's not necessarily bad, right? If you look at, it could be used to describe beautiful food. Look at this cupcake, beautiful food, and you're salivating. You've got a natural, legitimate desire because you want to eat the cupcake. And this is fulfilled in such a way that God is honored because God gave you that cupcake, as it were. If you look at epithumias used in various other passages, Luke 22, verse 15, let me read to you. He said to him, "I have earnestly desired to eat this Passover with you before I suffer. For I tell you, I will not eat of it until it's finished or fulfilled in the kingdom of God." This is Jesus using the word epithumias. Earnestly desired to eat this Passover. Now, Philippians 1:23, this is Paul, "I am hard pressed between the two, my desire, epithumias, to depart and to be with Christ. That is far better." So therefore, you can actually have epithumias, which is desire, which can be natural and normal. So if you go back to Genesis chapter 2, for the first love song, it was actually done when the men and women were naked, and it was done in the presence of God. If you look at Genesis 2:22, "And the rib that the Lord had taken out from the man, he made into a woman and brought her to the man. And the man said, 'Wow, this is at last the bone of my bones and the flesh of my flesh shall become woman,' because she was taken out of man. And therefore a man shall leave his father and mother and hold fast to his wife, and they shall become one flesh. And the man and woman were both naked and were not ashamed." Here we actually have a love song where 2 brought together for the first time, completely naked in the presence of God, and their desire was holy because God had made them in such a way. Look at Proverbs 5:15. "Drink from the water of your own cistern, flowing water from your own well. Should your springs be scattered abroad, streams of water on the streets, let them be for yourself alone, not for strangers with you. Let your fountain be blessed and rejoice in the wife of your youth. A lovely deer, a graceful doe, let her breast fill you at all times with delight and be intoxicated always in her love." So this describes the ecstasy involved in sex with the person for which you are in a covenant. Why should in verse 16, "your springs be scattered abroad and streams of water"? I mean, why should you waste all your sexual energy outside on the streets, as it were? Look at Song or Solomon's chapter 7 verse 7. Your stature, he describes his wife, is like a palm tree, and your breasts are like its clusters. I say, I will climb the palm tree, lay hold of its fruits. Oh, may your breasts be like clusters of the vine, and the scent of your breath like apples, and your mouth be like best wine. So this is describing the sexual process. Only thing, remember, you must brush your teeth, then not have a bad breath. So Jesus was not talking about sexual desire within the covenant. He was talking about sexual desire outside the covenant. You've heard it said before, you shall not commit adultery. So the topic is actually adultery, which is having sex with somebody else who is not your covenantal wife. Verse 28, I say to you that everyone who looks at a woman with lustful intent has already committed adultery with her in the heart. So it's actually the sexual desire that's stimulated by another person for which you desire to have sex with a person who is actually not your wife. Cut. The theologian D.A. Carson describes this as such. This is not a prohibition of the normal attraction which exists between men and women, but of the deep-seated lust which consumes and devours, which in imagination attacks and rapes, which mentally contemplates and commits adultery. So it's the intent. It is not the normal attraction that exists between men and women, which is quite automatic. If you see a beautiful woman, obviously you can appreciate all that, but it's a deep-seated lust. Actually, you start to undress her with your mind, and you actually want to have sex with somebody who is not your partner. So the nature of lust is like greed for money. There are a lot of similarities. In both cases, you have to have it for yourself. It's selfishness. It's also addictive. People will work hard for money. People will do whatever it takes to get the girl. It's like greed. You fantasize about what you will do when you get the money or when you get the girl, and you're looking to the girl or the money to give you the deep affirmation that only God can give you. So in a sense, it is actually idolatry. Pornography with masturbation. It's actually giving not yourself to the other person, but using images of lust in order to satisfy yourself. And all sex outside of marriage is using sex selfishly. Then what about young women? They often feel that they have to bargain and give sex in order for relational stability or to have love. Or they can't be a whole person or be a happy person, to be well developed unless they're married to a particular person or with that particular sweetheart. They say, I cannot live without you. To say that you cannot live without another person is to say that that other person is your idol. Now, how are we supposed to deal with lust? Well, Jesus describes that if your right eye causes you to sin, tear it out. And throw it away. For if it's better for you to lose one of your members than your whole body to be thrown into hell. And if your right hand causes you to sin, cut it out and throw it out. For it's better for you to lose one of your members than for your whole body to go into hell. Now here's a picture of Gehenna. Gehenna is a local rubbish tip inside, just outside Jerusalem. It's a place of perpetual burning of rubbish with smoke and fire. It's a place that describes unquenchable thirst, unfulfilled longing. And in a sense, going to hell is like having unsatisfactory sex, because we're built to fully know and fully be satisfied with Jesus Christ as our Lord. God will fill your deepest desires. When you lose God, you see, you have this unfulfilled longing and deep, unquenchable thirst as if you're in hell. Sex holds out the promise for affirmation and satisfaction. And yet when you actually have sex outside the marriage, it's something like the real thing, but it's not. It keeps you hungry and thirsty. It destroys your freedom, and you are out there, like a man who is basically marooned out on a life raft in an ocean full of salt water. You're thirsty, you want to drink, but you can't drink. You know why? It's salt water, and the more salt water you drink, the more thirsty you get. That is a picture of what lust is. Now, D.A. Carson describes this passage quite well. He says, if my right eye causes me to sin, so I'll just pluck it out. But what happens with your left eye? Your left eye will also see your neighbor's wife. Better pluck that out. Even if you pluck that out, you actually will have mental images of your neighbor's wife. And what will you do then? Pluck out your brain? So basically, what Jesus is saying is that it's not literally to pluck out your right hand, your right eye. It's basically to deal drastically with this problem of lust. We are not to flirt with it, pamper with it, or nibble around the edges. We have to hate it, we have to cut it out, we have to dig it out, we have to put it to death. It is a very serious problem. So lust, especially pornography, is not harmless. Some people think it's harmless, it doesn't affect your relationship, it's a bit of fun on the internet. There was a publication by Mark Regeners and Jeremy Euchre looking at premarital sex in America, looking at how young Americans meet, mate, and think about marrying. And actually 3 conclusions he found from that book, which he published. And he said, first of all, it affects everybody's relationship because you've got crushingly unrealistic expectation on the physical appearance of your partner and sexual performance. So you're actually taking your partner out, whether in real life, your partner or your girlfriend, and you're expecting that person to perform like a porn star in a blue movie. Men will have diminished tolerance for difficulties in real relationships. So when you're actually stuck on porn, when you actually get married or have a relationship with a real woman, you're going to have diminished tolerance for the difficulties in a real relationship because you don't have an in-depth relationship with a woman in the porn site. In a real woman, in a real world, there are difficulties, so men will have diminished tolerance for that. Thirdly, all women are increasingly made to accommodate to images and behavior in the porn. So these are the problems that you actually have with pornography. Now, pornography has also been shown in scientific studies to affect the brain. It shrinks the area of the brain called the striatum, which is a reward center. So when the reward center shrinks, you actually need more and more stimulus in order to feel the high. Number 2, it erodes your prefrontal cortex. This is a part of your brain that actually causes you to have impulsivity and poor control like a child. And basically, the more porn that you actually watch, the more impulsive and poor control you'll have. It also stimulates you and causes high levels of dopamine, and when you go back to your normal life with the normal levels of dopamine, it actually will trigger depressive illness, lower quality of life, and poor mental health. Oscar Wilde was a world-famous Irish poet and playwright towards the end of the 1880s to 1890s. And he was so famous, women threw themselves at him, and he could have any woman that he desired. He lived a life of sensuality and total sexual abandon. And this is what he writes of his life. The gods had given me almost everything, but I let myself be lured into long spells of senseless and sensual ease. Tired of being in the heights, I deliberately went into the depths in search of new sensation. What the paradox was to me in the sphere of thought, perversity became to me in the sphere of passion. I grew careless of the lives of others. I took pleasure where it pleased me, and I passed on. I forgot that every little action of the common day makes or unmakes character, and that therefore what one has done in the secret chamber, one has someday to cry out aloud from the housetop. I ceased to be the lord over myself. I was no longer the captain of my soul, and I didn't know it. Here's a man who had every sexual desire fulfilled, and his testimony was that he has ceased to be in control of his life. He was no longer the captain of his soul, and the worst part was he was not aware of it. These are the consequences of sex outside. Sex outside marriage, even serial monogamy, which is basically one partner at a time, actually hurts women more than men. You see, research has shown that women are more likely to express sexual regret. And for women, sex is largely unwanted apart from an emotional connection. And so they're more likely than men to experience diminished emotional health because of their past sexual relationships. The more life partners a woman has, the more likely she's going to be depressed and show signs of poor emotional health. And she doesn't realize this. She believes that sex will spur greater commitment from a partner, but in the end, in reality, sex destabilizes those very relationships she wants, producing uncertainty, insecurity, and even less commitment. So that's a problem with sex outside of marriage. So let me conclude this session of Gamma by bringing you a story from John chapter 4. Remember the woman whom Jesus met at the well? She was a Samaritan woman. And when he was getting water from the well, Jesus said to her, everybody who drinks from this water will be thirsty again. But whoever drinks from the water I will give him will never be thirsty again. And the woman said, I'd like to have that kind of water. So give me this water so I will not thirst again. And the funny thing right after that, you know what Jesus did? Jesus said to her, go and call your husband and ask him to come. And the woman said, look, I got no husband. And Jesus said, you're right. You have no husband, but you actually have had 5 husbands. Now the question is, why did Jesus, when this woman wants eternal life, this woman wants not to be thirsty forever, why is suddenly Jesus talking about her messed up sexual life? The reason why she's doing that, she has not only a physical thirst, because she has a spiritual thirst. Her spiritual thirst is that she wants to be satisfied, and she thinks her satisfaction in life is actually to be satisfied by men. She's had 5 men, and she's never been satisfied with 5 men. They've actually divorced her, she's divorced them. And what Jesus is saying, Jesus is addressing her deepest need. Her deepest need is a connection by God, of which she has actually settled for a counterfeit satisfaction. And that counterfeit satisfaction is actually satisfaction in sexual relationships outside of marriage. And Jesus is saying to her, I can satisfy your deepest needs. And she says, give me this water. And that day, that woman found her deepest longings fulfilled in Jesus Christ. Marriage is governed by Ephesians chapter 5. Now the church submits to Christ, so also the wives submit in everything to their husbands. Husband loves your wife as Christ loves the church and gave himself up for her, that he might sanctify her, having cleansed her by the washing of water with the word. So here you have a situation where there's no consumer relationship. It's not like I adjust to you, you adjust to me, I go halfway, you go halfway. No, they are both. The wife submits to the husband as she submits in her obedience to Christ. The husband loves the wife as Christ loved and gave himself for the church. That is the metric that actually describes the relationship. So this can only happen when both husband and wife are totally finding their needs and their thirst and their satisfaction not in each other, but in the Lord Jesus Christ. And then they'll be able to be filled with the love of Christ, and then they'll be in a position to give to each other without expecting return, a kind of unconditional love that will actually seek to build each other up. And that sex in that kind of relationship will be entirely fulfilling and will renew and bind the relationship even closer together. Well, I hope this session has been useful to all of us, and I hope that as we think about this subject, let us continue to pray and guard, because this is one of the greatest areas that will actually bring down our Christian lives if we're not careful. None of us are immune, all of us are vulnerable. Let's take Jesus' words to heart. Thank you.